married in the room, completely single, forever single, single not by choice, single because you want to be, wherever you fall, the thing to hear about a series on marriage is that when God talks about being in relationship with his people, he often uses marriage to illustrate and to highlight what that relationship looks like and how we as people respond to him as God, both in good things and sometimes in bad things, right? But he uses marriage as this beautiful illustration all along the way. We are calling this together 6 conversations for a lifetime of connection. As Jamarcus said earlier, our hope at Cornerstone is to help people connect with Christ and his community. We do that through the 6G values, and we live those out. And we see this in marriage. Today's value is goodness. We've talked about the other 5 previously. You're welcome to catch those online if you haven't seen them already and followed along. If you're new with us online today, welcome along. Check out the other messages in the series. Goodness, we define it this way: helping others to experience God's grace through love and good works. Normally, I get really excited to preach about goodness when it comes to how we operate with people in our community and how we operate with people who may live life far from God and don't know that God has come close to them yet. I think there's so much to be said about goodness and how we live, both locally and globally, and the impact of that is significant. Over and over and over through the New Testament, we see these dynamics of living into love and good works. As the church came together, this is where it was supposed to be. That as a good work people, the world would come to know God. It's that way with marriage from the beginning in Genesis chapter 1. That God made the man and the woman to be married together, and through that marriage, they would multiply and fill the earth. And as the earth would grow in its population and in its experience of each other, that the man and the woman in that marriage relationship, that men and women married together, would dictate how the world understood God. You can actually track direct correlations between rises in divorce and lack of marriage to a rise in atheism in the world today, in the Western world in particular. And you just go, it's about this witness of who God is. It's so significant. Marriage tells so much. And one of the biggest places where we need compassion and goodness to come alive is in the space of marriage. So today I want to take the aspect of goodness and love and grace and talk about amplifying love through compassion. How do you bring that into relationship with your spouse if you're married, and then make some correlations to that for those of us as we're looking at our life with God together? How does that compassion unfold with us? And maybe even how we see mission to others too. So I want to invite you to hear a passage this morning. I've selected Matthew chapter 9. I'm going to begin reading in verse 35, just the end of the chapter. This is a passage where Jesus challenges his disciples about their prayer life for the mission of God and what he sees in the world. But watch what happens, what Jesus says here. Jesus continued going around to all the towns and the villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and every sickness. Let's pause there. At this moment, Jesus is a recognized rabbi in his community. Not anyone could get up and go preach at the synagogue. You had to be a recognized rabbi. We often think about Jesus being a carpenter. He was the carpenter's son. That statement's more of an accusation because everybody had speculation in his world that Joseph wasn't really his dad, right? You can track that back to his birth narrative. That Mary got pregnant while they were betrothed, but not while they were married. They were supposed to have a year's engagement together before they consummated, which means that Mary was pregnant before that year was over, created lots of scandal in their world, right? So he was the carpenter's son. Somewhere around the age of 12, we see Jesus completely mystify the Pharisees with his teaching. How can a kid like this understand the way of God and the scriptures? What most of us would recognize as maybe a bar mitzvah moment probably is Jesus actually passing his rabbinical exam, and no one thought he should take it because he's the carpenter's son. But he blows them away. So when you see Jesus show up on the scene, when people recognize him, one of the first things that they say is, it's the rabbi. How do you recognize a rabbi? This is not a joke, by the way. How do you recognize a rabbi? In the ancient world, a rabbi would have had a particular way that he dressed. You know, in the modern world, we come out with this whole priestly dynamic and collars and all this kind of stuff. In the ancient world, the rabbi had a particular look that everybody knew who the rabbis were because they were dressed a certain way. So when Jesus shows up on the scene, they go, oh, there's a rabbi. So he's recognized in this way. And so he would be welcome to go teach and preach in the synagogues, even if the Pharisees didn't like what he was saying. Because he's still a rabbi, and rabbis are respected in the ancient world. They were the voice. They were the celebrities. Oh, here comes Rabbi so-and-so, or Rabbi this, or Rabbi that. And you wanted to be connected to a rabbi. And so Jesus shows up. He's preaching the good news. He's healing many diseases and every sickness. When he saw the crowds, he felt compassion for them because they were distressed and dejected like sheep without a shepherd. Do you know what happens to sheep without a shepherd eventually? They'll starve themselves to death. Sheep are not the most intelligent of animals. Sheep and goats in particular, when they graze, like if you watch cows graze, not that you got to go, hey, our anniversary is this week, Corey. How about we go watch cows graze? It's not the most enjoyable sounding activity, right? Cows are like a lawnmower. Chop, 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 chop. They leave grass at the roots. Sheep and goats are not. They pull everything up by the root. They leave the field bare. So if you left the sheep to be without a shepherd, to move them to good water, safe ground, protection, like, I don't know if you've seen a sheep lately, not many defense mechanisms about them. And then they would eat to a point where they had no food left. Like sheep without shepherds, Jesus saw the people. Sheep have to be cared for. They have to be cared for. So when it says that Jesus sees people like sheep without a shepherd, he's not sitting back with like some modern shade going, man, this is some stupid people. That's not what he's thinking. This word compassion changes the whole game. They need to be cared for. They're dejected and distressed. And he says to his disciples, the harvest is abundant, but the workers are few. Therefore, pray to the Lord of the harvest to send out workers. So we deal with this dynamic of compassion. Compassion describes the interior state of Jesus with more frequency than any other emotion when it comes to how the language of the Gospels is used. We can see all kinds of things. Like there's pieces when you understand like nuances of the language. Jesus is like telling jokes with his guys, and that's kind of fun to watch. We often take Jesus so serious that when he tells a joke, he's always telling it like this, you know. But he's actually, you can see these kinds of things. You see Jesus filled with joy and celebration. You see Jesus weep when his friend Lazarus dies. But the emotion that is most connected to Jesus in the telling of his story is compassion. He looked at people and he had compassion. When we think about the word compassion, splanknizomai. It just twists you even saying splanknizomai. You should try and say that really quickly, like it's natural to you, right? Is the Greek word for compassion, and it means a twisted feeling in the guts. Now, when you think about compassion, what do you most often think of? Do you think about being so burdened and twisted over something? Or do you think about something really calm and peaceful, and he showed compassion on the crowds? See, compassion was like gut-wrenching. Most of the time when we think about gut-wrenching, like put yourself on a roller coaster. Anybody like roller coasters in the room or online? If you have a favorite roller coaster online, go ahead and drop it in the comment bar. I'd like to check it out someday. You get on a roller coaster, and you take these ups and downs. Corey and I were in Virginia years ago, and we went to Busch Gardens, and Busch Gardens has a ride called Apollo's Chariot. And you get in the ride, and it's a launching ride. So it doesn't tick, 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 tick. It doesn't, Sit down, 3, 2, 1. And you launch fast. I mean, you're riding the chariots of the Greek gods here, so it's got to be fast, right? And the first thing it does is go straight up and then down, and then 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 around, and you're off. And you feel splagizomai at the end of it, right? There's a twisting of the guts in riding that ride. When I see my wife, I still get butterflies over her. Butterflies in the belly are different than splagizomai, a twisting. It's completely uncomfortable because of what you're witnessing. And because it's so twisted, you have to do something about it, right? Like, this is one of the few times when Jesus says he had compassion on the crowds that you don't see an immediate secondary action. In this one, you see all the action before, right? He was going through the towns. He was preaching the good news. He was talking about the kingdom of heaven. He was healing every disease and every sickness. And he had compassion on them as he got to be close to them because he saw their distress and their dejection and that they were like sheep without shepherds. And the biggest thing he did was he asked the disciples, he says, we need to pray for the Lord of the harvest to send workers. And so this is kind of the dynamic. Every time we see Jesus moved by compassion, he responds with a direct and correlating action. I have been guilty in my marriage of not catching a clue, right? Fair. Maybe you've been in that same dynamic. Like, there is something happening, and I respond with the wrong action. Like, I can respond directly, but not always with a correlating action. It happens. Over the weekend, Corey and I were over at our oldest daughter's spot, Zach and Anna Grace, and helping them with some projects on their home. Zach and I both have very high ADHD, right? Diagnosed high ADHD. Do you know what it's like trying to do home improvement projects with two people who are highly ADHD? And you're not? Corey is not. She's like, remember the task, remember the task, remember. This is the list, guys. Why are we doing this one right now? I thought we were working on this one. The best thing for me to happen is that some of the projects had to dry so you can go start 5 more. Right? And then throughout the day, you keep working on every project and you work in a circle and eventually they all finish. And then you go, oh, look, it's all done. Well, how did it get done? Your actions didn't seem very correlating. You just finished the project and moved on. How many trips to Home Depot does it take? That should be a joke. Right? I think we finished 7 projects and took 6 trips. Yeah, that's about right. But Jesus gets moved with compassion, sees the crowds, and has a direct and correlating action. Let's all revisit 4 years ago for a minute. You pull the politics out of the situation. How many of us wrestled with the tensions of, I don't want to wear a mask, I don't want to get a vaccine, I don't want to be isolated, I don't think they should be burning down the city, I don't think, and you start to go through all these different pieces, and as we watch the crowds around us, was compassion the emotion that you felt? Or was it something different? It's not an accusing statement. I've shared this before when it comes to goodness. It was one of the most uncertain and lost times that I went through personally because I watched a world see things happen and the direct response did not initiate a correlating action. It was compassionless on the larger narrative. And you start to go, how in the world does that happen? And when you start to think about that, right, without compassion, relationships become hardened. You start to think about compassion in the life of your spouse. How many times have you looked at your spouse and gone, not again? Why are they acting this way again? And maybe you're not the one to beat the table in front of somebody, but inside you feel that seething. And instead of seeing your spouse with compassion, the lens by which you look at your spouse is something different. And when compassion begins to wane, relationships become hardened. I've got several situations that I'm working through right now, and people use this phrase, and it's the most common reason for divorce: irreconcilable differences. And I listen to people and I go, is it really irreconcilable, or are they differences that have yet to be reconciled? And because they've compounded over time and compounded over time and compounded over time, you've lost compassion for each other. And in that dynamic, the relationship has become hardened, and we begin to permit ourselves into places that become destructive. Compassion is huge when it comes to relationships. We talk about this. We need to know that we can count on each other rather than turn on each other. Think about that one for a moment. When it comes to our relationships, when it comes to our relationship with God, I need to know that I can count on him and that he's not going to turn on me. But how many times will I sit here and wait for God to do something different that's opposite of his character because I'm kind of acting opposite of character, or maybe true to character? God never changes. He's full of grace and mercy and justice and love. Compassion moved Christ. And I need to know in relationship with my spouse, and Corey needs to know from me that she can count on me rather than me turning on her in those moments when we're most needed. But we live in a world that we think we celebrate authenticity and vulnerability until we have to be authentic and vulnerable. We think it's really great for man, they're so authentic, they're so vulnerable, they're so real. And then when it comes my turn to be that, I want to shut that off because I'm afraid that people are going to turn on me rather than be there for me. Do you feel that way? And that happens in our marriage relationship especially, right? I mean, you've gone through this thing. Corey and I we were talking this morning over coffee, and this year marks our 26th year of marriage. This week on Thursday is our anniversary, and she's like, did you ever think 26 years ago that this is where we would be? I mean, well, what do you mean by that? I mean, because 26 years ago, I thought I might have more hair than I do today, right? See? If you know, you know. Did we expect to have 6 kids? Did we expect to, enter the foster adopt situation? Did we expect to, I don't know, have grandchildren on the way? Did we expect to live in Minnesota of all places? Like she actually said, I never thought we would leave Texas. We haven't been back since we left. And you start to see us. And over all that time, we've made mistakes towards each other. We've lived life without compassion towards each other. But in the long run, she needs to know that I can be counted on for her and vice versa. We think about this dynamic. There are obstacles to compassion in our relationships. One of those is pleasing. Just because someone's grumpy doesn't mean they have to be appeased. We think by pleasing people and by always pleasing others that we're doing something good for them. But what happens is when we live into a people-pleasing relationship, we're not actually doing good and compassionate things for them. We actually end up hindering intimacy because it's never about mutuality. It's always about the other person and the person who lives on the pleasing side. And I don't mean you don't want to do something good for your spouse. I love doing good things for Corey. I love to make her happy. I think life works better when my wife is happy with me. Typically. She's nodding her head. There are times, though, Corey, close your ears. Thanks, Lisa. There are times when Corey's living opposite of God's direction. What she most needs at that moment is not me to go, yeah, you're right. And there are days when I'm not acting in God's best interest for my life. If I wasn't painting it nicer, Jimmy, I'd call it sinning, right? And I don't need Corey to tell me that's okay. I need her to confront me on those things. When I live a pleasing life, I am actually not doing anything that is going to show this compassion, like genuine compassion, that like just to fill this and make it, to appease it, to make it calm and quiet, to please others. That's not where it is. That's not compassion. Pity. Pity is not compassion. Pity doesn't see another person as an equal by definition. Compassion sees us as equals. That was the tension going through COVID. We didn't see each other as equals. That was the tension going through the outfall of the George Floyd killing. We didn't see each other as equals. We saw each other as adversaries, whether politically or spiritually or racially or economically. We didn't see each other as equals. And what happens when I look at Corey and go, oh, bless her heart, and I give pity to her, I am not treating her as an equal. I'm treating her as lesser. Pity is not compassion. When Jesus looked at the crowds, he didn't have pity on them. Oh, pity all those people. If only they had a shepherd to take care of them. He's moved. Like pity sees each other and elevates each other. That's compassion. Pity sees us in a hierarchy. I've got it so much better. Let me help you out. So pity's not the way. It's actually, we can show pity, and it's actually going to create an obstacle to compassion, which is going to create an obstacle to connection and intimacy. So we got to make sure we're here fixing. If I could just fix that person, I wouldn't have to deal with these things anymore. If I could just fix the situation, we wouldn't have to be here. Corey and I have been talking about all the times like parents try to fix their kids and fix their kids' problems. And what we fail to realize a lot of times as parents is that God is building a testimony in our kids that they're going to be able to tell one day that they need to talk about God, not me. The kid needs to be able to talk about, this is the time I went through trouble, and here's how God pulled me through, not how mom covered my mess with some frosting. And our spouses need that too. They need compassion, not fixing. Would you believe after 26 years I have found some things about Corey that aren't the best? She knew that in year 2 about me, by the way. But instead of fixing each other, lean into each other's weaknesses with compassion. There are so many ways where I am deficient that Corey is strong. And when we recognize that in each other, it's not about fixing, it's about elevating. We talked a little bit about that giftedness dynamic last week and just how do we live into this space. Fixing becomes an obstacle to true compassion. Judging. Sometimes the most judgmental statement we make in marriage sounds innocent. Why do you have to be that way? What way? The way that you are. The way that you're acting right now. Why do you have to be that way? That is a hyper-judgmental statement that sounds like it's trying to care about somebody. And it probably is, caring about the person asking the question. right? So when judging the spouse is not compassion. Like recognizing the hardship, when Jesus looked at the crowd with compassion because they were distressed and dejected, he's not saying, oh, you people over there. He's walking with them. And with our spouses, that's where they need us to be, is to walk with us. God walks with us through things. Does God judge and correct? Yes, and there's a time for that. But judging and correcting isn't compassion. Meeting the need, elevating the soul, that's where compassion comes alive. There's some opportunities, and it begins right here. Be compassionate to yourself. There are so many of us who will take all the things we just said that we shouldn't do towards our spouse or towards another person, and we will do them to ourselves. We will judge ourselves. We will try to fix ourselves. We will pity ourselves. Right? We talk about my personal pity party, we will try to appease ourselves, right? Like those 5 o'clock Starbucks vacations, that we find after work. Be compassionate with yourself. Start there. Sometimes looking at the mirror and going, I don't like where my life is, and feeling twisted about it and moving forward with it. And maybe the move forward, the best you can do is just to tell somebody else. To let the Lord know. He sees us already, but to just be profoundly honest with him. This is what it looks like. Radical honesty with each other. Radical honesty. Like, this is scary because we don't even like to be radically honest with God. I just kind of touched on that. Like, I know people, when I'm praying with them sometimes, they'll say, God, forgive me of my sin, when really what they want to say is, God, forgive me of my addiction, and they won't go there because they're afraid of what everybody's going to think or maybe what God will think, even though the addiction's already there. God, forgive me that I blow my finances. And instead of saying that, they'll say, God, bless my finances. Well, let's get it in the right order. I want God to bless my finances, and I'm blowing it, so let me confess it and receive it, right? So radical honesty. If I can't be radically honest with God, I'm probably not going to be radically honest with my spouse. And you will be shocked if you live in a world where you and your spouse show compassion to each other, how much radical honesty together can actually deepen intimacy. It's scary. It's scary. But it deepens so much your relationship with God and your relationship with your spouse. Courageous vulnerability. When Corey and I, probably around year 20, about 6 years ago, she confronted me about our talking together. And she says, every time we try to have a real conversation about something, you get very robotic and very, everything comes out very precise. This is your question. Here is the response. Compute, And she says, why? Why is this happen? Why, when we try to have this real talk, does everything, like your body language, like everything got tense? My words, my cadence, everything changed. And we got to a point where, as we started talking it through, and I was meeting with a spiritual director at the time, we got to a point where physically I would actually just have to sit there with my hands open like this and down and put my body in a posture of vulnerability. And then what we began to realize is that my tone began to change in having those conversations. But there were things that I was being so guarded with. And if you were here, this is, talking about some real things that happened in my life, and we had to kind of pull some of those pieces out and talk real about some of that hurt, and that was where we went. And that vulnerability has shifted, I think, since then, even though we've been pretty open with each other most of our relationships. She recognized something that was being very guarded. So courageous vulnerability. Empathetic action, seeing my wife, caring about what she needs, and meeting that need, making an action. Remember, when Jesus had compassion, When he had compassion, there was a direct and correlating response, right? So an empathetic action, when it comes to compassion, sees the situation, hears the situation, and has a direct and correlating response. Corey revealing this deep emotional hurt, me wanting to meet into that space does not mean go build her a vegetable garden. It's a great gift. Look, honey, I made a vegetable garden for you. That's fine, but my heart is broken. So any other moment, I could build her a vegetable garden. It would probably be fine. I heard this. No empathy whatsoever. I took a left turn. What do you do? So an empathetic action sees the distress and the dejection, meets that space, and has a direct and correlating response. That's what Jesus did. We're trying to bring that into our relationship with our spouses. This is the space of showing compassion to one another. Seeing that compassion, living that compassion in relationship to who God is in us. God sees us perfectly, even though we're not perfect. He invites us to have that radical honesty, that courageous vulnerability. He meets us with the right action at the right time in the right place for the right need. He's there. In those same kinds of ways is how God is inviting us to deepen intimacy together, that we can have witness to one another about who God is in our relationships. I'm going to pray. After I pray, I want to invite you to meet my new friend, AJ. AJ is with the Real Hope Project. Real Hope is a space that brings compassion alive even today. So hear what she has to say. There's a table outside in the foyer that has more. This is near and dear to Corey and I's heart when it comes to the lives that we live, as they help connect kids in need of families with homes.